told me her father was the publisher of the first bilingual Chinese-English newspaper. He was a grocer who sold his own grocery store because he had always wanted to publish a paper. So then he started publishing anything he could get his hands on, programs, menus, restaurant ads, but on his spare time, he will write a paper. And she said, well, my dad's retired, he's got all this paper in his basement, we don't know what to do with it. And I had a student asking me for a summer internship. So we very quickly had a student go and interview Mr. Lee, and Mr. Lee donated all his papers to our library. And then 2 months after that, he passed away. We had a chronic illness. But he was so proud to have his story documented, preserved in an archive. And so that became something that the community really wanted to do. Friends would tell me, you got to interview Mr. XYZ because he's 80, he's got a history of Asian American activities in Houston. And so we kind of grew that way. We're happy because Houston is a very large city full of Asian Americans, but there's no real depository of Asian American history anywhere that we can really find. So now we have collected, over 12 years, 450 interviews. And we hope that the next person who writes the official history of Texas would then add Asian American contribution into its narrative, which right now is not quite there. So we're going to start. So as I said, Houston is the 4th largest city in the country, about to be going to number 3 if we can surpass Chicago, but not quite. And we are the 7th largest city in terms of Asian American population.
7th largest city in the world?
In this country, sorry.
In the country.
What's first?
For Asian population, it could be New York or it could be LA, one of them.
Now, how do you define Asian America? What is?
Good question. So it's basically self-identified.
Okay.
And so in our archive, we're Pan-Asian, meaning we interview and accept people who come from East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China, and then Southeast Asia, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Asian, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. We even include people from Asia Minor, like Lebanon, who would add if they want to give us their stories. So you can see that the demographic change, and this you might have seen with the Kinder Institute speaker, that this is a Kinder Institute slide, how the demographic change occurred from 1960 all the way to 2016. And then the slice that's green is the percentage of Asian American, and it has grown quite a bit over the years. And this is only Harris County, it's not Fort Bend. And Fort Bend is our model of diversity. As you can see on the left, we're really approaching almost parity, right? The ideal would be 25% Asian, 25% Latinos, 25% Blacks, 25% Anglos. I don't think any county in this country would ever approach that, but Fort Bend County certainly is approaching really an ideal proportion, whereas Montgomery County is still predominantly white. So what is the definition of, we hear this term about AAPI, right, and that stands for Asian American Pacific Islander. Basically, they're not only people from China and Korea and Japan, which we all know, but all people from Kazakhstan, from Afghanistan, from Papua New Guinea. They're all considered part of the AAPI community. And so if you really look into the national breakdown, there's a lot of countries in there that are lumped into this AAPI nation group. And it's interesting that many of my Chinese students come from China and say, I never realized I'm a minority, because in China I'm a majority, but here I am part of AAPI, what is that? And so it's a shift in the way they think about themselves. And so in Texas, we have about 1.8 million Asian Americans or AAPI people spread out mainly in the metropolitan areas, Houston, Dallas, and Austin. And we also have further breakdown that in different counties, different proportions of Asians. So in Harris County, we have a majority of Vietnamese, and then the second largest group would be Indians, and the third largest group would be Chinese, except for Taiwanese. In Dallas, the proportion is different. There are more Indians than Vietnamese. Travis County, there are again more Indians than Vietnamese, and the Chinese were the second group. So these are the different kind of ethnic breakdowns. So we often think about what does it mean to be Asian in a country that's basically bifurcated between white and black. And so 2 of the people we interviewed had interesting stories. Viola Chen was actually born in Chicago. Her father was a chef, and she moved around a lot. So when my student asked her, did you ever feel discrimination? She said, well, not really. In Chicago, except one time when she came home from school, on the way home she found an ad for a job in a store. She went home, called, and they said, well, come on down for an interview. But when she came down, they said, oh, we're so sorry, the job just got filled. So clearly because she was Asian. And then she came to Houston to take care of her sister's babies. And she found that if you rode on a bus, if you're African American, you sat in the back. If you're white, you sat in the front. And she thought, neither one or the other, what do I do? So she stood in the middle of the bus because she didn't know what to do until she bought a car. Eugenie Chen was a graduate student from Taiwan, and she met her host family at a bus stop in Houston. She was thirsty, so she wanted to go and get a drink of water. Now, she looked at the color fountain and the white fountain, and she went straight for the color. Her host family, which is white, said, no, you go to the white fountain. She said, why? I want to see what color is the water in the colored fountain. It's kind of indicative that they have no idea where they belong in this, in the stratification in this society. So we study and we realize there are 4 areas in the law where the language of law basically targets Asians. The first is the federal law on immigration, who gets to come into this country. The second is the law on naturalization, who gets to become a naturalized citizen once you're in this country. And then the state statutes and city ordinances, where are you allowed to live, where are you allowed to buy a house, and then what kind of jobs are you even able to get. And then the last one is requirement of citizenship for employment and procurement of certain services. So if you wanted to work in a sugarcane field or cotton field and pick cotton and cut sugarcane, it's backbreaking, hard, and very poorly paid jobs. And nobody asks, you can just go in and do that. However, if you want to weigh cotton, which is a much easier job, much better paid, you have to show proof of citizenship. So these are the restrictions that will target an Asian immigrant and not necessarily any other kind of immigrant. But if you look at the Constitution, it's a very idealistic document. As we know, after the abolition of slavery, Civil Rights Bill came along, and the first one in 1866 basically said that all persons born in the U.S. shall receive citizenship except for American Indians. 2 years later, the 14th Amendment said all persons born and naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. And then 2 years later, Civil Rights Bill said the government will extend equal protection of the law to all within the jurisdiction of the U.S. And then even further, 5 years later, even more magnanimous, the government will extend equal and exact justice for all of whatever nativity, race, color, persuasion, religious, or political, which is extremely generous. However, it didn't quite apply to Asian immigrants. I'm sorry? Sorry. Or please feel free to talk and ask me questions. So the first law that really came down against the Chinese are against Chinese women. So the Chinese labor actually were imported into the U.S. after the abolition of slavery because slaves left the plantation. There was a big shortage of laborers to work hard, to do hard labor. So the U.S. government and the Chinese government entered into a treaty where they actually imported Chinese laborers. These men worked very, very hard. They're very happy to take very little wage. And so at the very beginning, you see in the newspaper praise for the Chinese workers, and they're diligent, they're hardworking, but very soon they earned the ire of the Irish male workers, and they were basically, the government started trying to figure out how to get rid of them.
So what kind of work were they doing? Because they obviously weren't working plantations.
They were.
They were?
Yeah,
Oh,
because
really?
the slaves left, and then they needed people to work.
Come on, from Virginia, and I've never heard that they were.
I think most of them were coming to South.
Okay.
Well, at first, some of the Chinese came in during the gold rush in 1848.
In California, yeah.
And then when the gold dried up, they went into railroad work. So the
Right.
Transcontinental
Yeah.
Railroad.
Right.
When that stopped, they started trickling down to the South, so mainly Mississippi, Alabama,
Okay.
probably not many in Virginia. Yeah.
But they were working farm
Yes.
kind of field. Okay.
What was the context of China at this time?
Yeah, good point. China's very poor. So from 1839 on, China had the Opium War, where China refused at the beginning to open up ports to trade with Britain. And then there were some gunboats that came in and started blowing apart the Chinese cities to force the Chinese to open up their trade. And then the Chinese didn't want to buy anything because they had, they didn't want, Britain was importing wool, which the Chinese felt was scratchy on their skin.
Sure.
Britain was
Didn't
importing
need it.
cotton, the Chinese said we have better cotton. So the Chinese had to think the British wanted. They wanted a silk, British wanted Chinese silk, Chinese porcelain, and Chinese
Opium.
and tea. Well, no, tea. So they were getting so much tea and silk in China from China, their silver was draining out of the British coffer. And they were trying to figure out how can we do this. Balanced trade was, terrible. Opium. So what they did was to plant opium in India. It's a lower grade opium than the Chinese had opium for medicine. It was a higher grade, but more expensive. So the British were planting opium in India, a cheaper grade of opium, shipped it to China, sold it to the Chinese who were very quickly addicted, and then started using traded opium for all the stuff they wanted. So when the Chinese government realized that, they stopped it and came the first opium war. And with superior gunboats and everything, the Chinese lost terribly. And so then the unequal treaties where the Chinese had to give a lot of silver in exchange for opening up ports, and the missionaries came to China. And then the Chinese did not learn. They kept on resisting. But then the French came, the Americans came, the Russians came. So war after war after war, the Chinese lost more and more silver. So by 1850 down to 1900, China was a disaster. And not only was the external issue a big problem, there were a lot of natural disasters. There were famine, there were earthquakes, the people had no jobs. There was a lot of civil unrest, there were a lot of bandits running over China. So it was a very bad time. I mean, it's very long answer.
So the people were all willing to leave because they had no job.
They were willing to leave, yeah. And then they were coming out of the coastal area because the inland people, it was hard for them to leave. So most of the early Chinese coming to this country were all near Canton, near Hong Kong, in the southeast part of China. So the first law was against Chinese women. They figured the women can't come in, you can't have children, you can't have a community. So the way they did it was 1875, they said, well, all Chinese women came in had to prove that they were not prostitutes. The reason is, the Chinese men usually have more than one wife. So if the first Mrs. Wang came in with Mr. Wang, the second woman, Mrs. Wang, who came in through Angel Island, would tell the immigration officer, I'm Mrs. Wang. But then the officer said, wait, there is a Mrs. Wang in the country already. You're either a mistress or a prostitute or something else, or you're not allowed in. So then women stopped coming in, and then so most of the Chinese men who didn't have a wife in this country couldn't get a wife. And so the Chinatown was basically a bachelor's den. And of course, bachelor's den, you have gambling, you have opium smoking, it was pretty bad. And then the second treaty in 1880 was to negate the U.S. government, Chinese government treaty of 1868, stopping the import of Chinese laborers completely. Then in 1882, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which a lot of people have talked about, it's when all Chinese were not allowed into this country unless you were a student, a diplomat, or a businessman. So that would cut out 95% of Chinese. And then 1888 was another law that said if you had been a laborer in this country and you were going back to China to see your family, before, all you had to do is get a certificate return, and then you can come back from China back into this country. Well, the Scott Act basically, no. Once you're out of the U.S., you can come back, even if you have a certificate. And that cut out more people. And then the Gary Act is a 10-year extension of the Exclusion Act, and in 1902, another 10-year, in 1904, indefinite extension of the Exclusion Act, meaning no Chinese labor can come in, only diplomats, students, and businessmen. The whole thing was not repealed until 1943 because then China entered World War II with the U.S. as an ally. And then the U.S. figured, well, we better treat the people in our ally countries better. But this only applied to China, and to your point. They did very different situation with Japan because Japan was a very strong country in late 19th century. So when the Chinese couldn't come in, there was still a shortage of labor. So they imported Japanese. So at the beginning, before 1908, in early 20th century or even late 19th century, Japan was a naval power in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. really needed Japan as an ally in the ocean, and so it treated Japanese citizens much better. But then when the Japanese were coming, the laborers coming in, getting the job of the white male, the government had to figure out a way to get rid of the Japanese. So it was a gentleman's agreement with Japan where the U.S. government would agree to treat the existing Japanese in this country better, with giving some rights to them, unlike what they did with Chinese. But the Japanese government would voluntarily stop immigration of Japanese into this country. So when the Japanese couldn't come in, there's still a shortage of labor, so they used India. South Asians came in. Well, pretty soon, the South Asians also ran into trouble. People didn't want them there. So in 1917, another immigration law came down, and that's when they created Asiatic bar zone, where all those countries like India, Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, all the way down to Saudi Arabia, that zone on a map would be considered the banned countries, Asiatic barred zone. So people from those areas couldn't even come in. 1917.
No matter if they were diplomats or,
Probably there were some exceptions, and
Okay,
maybe if you have
of course.
family, you're allowed in, but very, very few. Right?
Is the white.
So finally, there was a reform in 1924. And what they're saying is, okay, we should be a little more fair. So let's do a percentage. So 2% of the existing ethnic people in this country would be allowed in. But since this country is mainly Northern European, 2% of Northern Europeans allowed into this country would be much bigger than 2% of the Asians coming in. But that was one reform. And finally, in 1952, there was another reform saying, well, let's just say we allow 2,000 Asians coming into this country per year from the Asian Pacific Triangle, which included Japan, China, and all those Asiatic bar zone, which means maybe 100 Chinese were allowed to come in at that time. And because altogether 2,000 per year from that gigantic chunk of the world is not very much. The big reform that finally came down is 1965, when I think Edward Kennedy championed this bill and allowed 170,000 immigrants coming from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere. So many of the Asian professionals, the Indian doctors, engineers you see, all came in after 1965 because they really could not come in before then. So this is a very different situation from the Constitution. However, the Chinese did not take any of this lying down. As you know, the illegal immigration has continued. In fact, there was the Chinese were trying to cross the border from Mexico to U.S. even in those days. And there's a tunnel that's dug from one part of Mexico all the way through El Paso, where the Chinese were smuggled in. People have always ways to figure things out, right?
Yeah.
And they actually hired very good lawyers. They actually sued all the way to the Supreme Court for some kind of justice. So the first case in 1889 is the Che campaign versus the United States. Mr. Che actually went back to visit his family after having obtained a certificate of return from San Francisco. He's working there. However, when he was on his way home, that 1888 Scott Act already cut down saying you can come back. So he sued all the way to the Supreme Court. Court said, sorry, the government had this law, we cannot let you come in, so he was deported. 1893, Mr. Feng Yueting, he and two other of his friends were itinerant laborers or something, and they were going up and down the East Coast. There was a government restriction on Chinese immigrants only, where you have to have a certificate of residence. None of the other immigrants had to have that, but the Chinese had to have that. He didn't get one because it was moving up and down too much. So therefore, he was not allowed in the country, deported. This is determined by your race, by your religion, by your political beliefs, sexual orientations, and other arbitrary criteria that you do not apply if you're a U.S. citizen. So the key is, how can you become a U.S. citizen? And why does the court allow the government to have a say? Basically, the court is allowing political dictate over constitutional civil rights bill. Well, the reason is that there is something called the plenary power doctrine, which the Supreme Court basically said that immigration is a national security issue. And so, over no conceivable subject is the legislative power of Congress more complete than it is over the admissions of aliens. The power to expel or exclude aliens is a fundamental sovereign attribute exercised by the government's political departments, largely immune from judicial control. And that's why in immigration issues, Congress has more power than the court. This is why today ICE can raid apartment complexes, restaurants, and factories, take people out without having them all go through the courts necessarily. So then the key then for every immigrant is, how can I become a citizen? If I became a citizen, I'm protected. If I can't be a citizen, I'm basically in trouble. So who gets to be a citizen? So way back in 1790, if you're a free white person and who lived in this country for 2 years, you can be a citizen, no matter when you came into this country. And as we heard earlier, the Civil Rights Bill said white person, African American, except not American Indians, were all given all kinds of rights, but not the immigrants. So in Mr. Yup's case, he says, I was born in China, but I have been in this country for 20 years, and I feel like I'm an American. Can I get citizenship? Well, so that the judge Lorenzo Sawyer say that, well, the question is, if you're Chinese, you're considered Mongolian race. Is a person of the Mongolian race a white person or not? But apparently it's a very messy definition, because when 1852, when the Chinese laborers welcomed into this country, yeah, the Chinese were a subset of the white population, so in those days you probably could get citizenship. Very soon, 2 years later, they were now becoming annoying people. Then the definition of white started excluding skin colors. So then white no longer, if you're black, yellow, and other color, you're no longer white, you cannot get citizenship. Now in 1870, when Japan was still a strong US ally, a favorite country, the Japanese were considered Turks and Arabians, Frenchmen of the East. Then they were allowed to get citizenship.
How did they make the jump that Japanese are Turks
I know,
and
isn't that funny?
Arabians?
Yeah, I know.
How is that possible?
But you know, in those days, people's idea of race is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
It's very
Whatever
subjective.
served their purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, it served their purpose, exactly. Because Japan was able to help the U.S. militarily, and the U.S. needed Japan as an ally. Japan was almost as powerful as Britain and Germany in their estimation for the
For the
naval.
Pacific.
Yeah, for the Pacific safety and security. So then Mr. Yamashita, who was born in Japan, went to the University of Washington Law School, passed the bar with flying color, was not able to practice law because he was not a U.S. citizen and couldn't get citizenship. Mr. Ozawa basically said, I was born in Japan, but I've lived in the U.S. for 40 years. I feel like an American. Can I get citizenship? No, sorry, you're not white, therefore you can't get citizenship. So Mr. Baga, same time, was Indian. 1923 said, well, the Indians are categorized as Caucasian. They're Aryans. They're not Mongolians. If I'm Caucasian, Americans are Caucasian. Can I be a citizen? Said no, because yes, you are Caucasian, you're Aryan, but you're a brown Caucasian. You're not a white Caucasian. Therefore, you don't have the right color. You can get. So it's all very, very arbitrary. As you can see this analysis.
And did all of these go to the Supreme Court?
Yes, when you visit the United States,
Yes, it
these
is.
are famous landmarks. Yeah. So then finally, all of these things were finally repealed for the Chinese in 1943 because China entered a war with U.S. and ally. Chinese were finally able to get citizenship given certain conditions, and then 3 years later, the Indians, the Filipinos were all allowed to apply for citizenship. Finally, in 1952, everybody comes into this country with certain kind of stipulation. You can get citizenship. Okay. So what happens in Texas? Well, there were very few Chinese, but some of them stayed because of the railroad work. There was an Irish guy who killed a Chinese in 1880s, and then the judge was somebody famous called named Judge Whitney, who's famous for ruling his cases in a bar. He's often drunk. So about 200 friends of this Irish guy were outside the bar and saying, if the judge found my friend, the Irish guy, guilty, we're going to lynch and hang the judge. So basically the judge said, well, I find the law very explicit on murdering a fellow man, but there's nothing here about killing a Chinaman, case dismissed. So if you're a Chinese, you have no legal protection in Texas in those days. Therefore, understandably, very few Chinese were in Texas. So my friend who combs through Yellow Pages of those days said that in the Yellow Pages from 1905 to 1920, maybe there are 2 Chinese laundry shops and 3 restaurants. People didn't want to be here. But also there's something called the Jim Crow laws, and you all probably are familiar with what that is. And they were applied in 34 states in the Union. They targeted African Americans, but the Chinese, again, because they're neither white or black, they are sometimes subject to the Jim Crow laws, sometimes they're not. But even as early as 1870, reporters from the newspaper Houston Telegraph observed some of the Chinese in the state and said, the Chinese had no intention of being common laborers all their lives. They had been saving their earnings, aside from the amounts sent back to China, to go into business for themselves. So very often you read that these Chinese who came down to work on the plantations, they figured this is backbreaking work with very little money. So then they would quit. They would actually break the contract, and then they'll band together, squirrel some savings away, and open little stores near the plantation, sell stuff to the slaves, and very soon band together to get grocery stores and just get out of that system. So, for instance, if you're a Jim Crow law, the African Americans couldn't go to school with white, but the Chinese in Texas were able to go to school with white. So Martha Wong, who's a PhD, and she was a councilman Her father was a grocer in Mississippi. He sold his business because Mississippi couldn't go to school with white people. And then the school, there was a Chinese school, but there weren't very good teachers. So he basically moved his whole family to Texas because she can now go to school with white. However, the deed restrictions that you can't live in certain communities, you cannot have, you cannot get money from white banks, and you cannot deal with a lot of white businesses. Those things apply to the Chinese. And then lots of daily dignity. So for instance, that picture, the guy in white is probably a Chinese laundryman, and he's trying to get on the sidewalk, but there's a guy blocking his way. So then, we did a lot of interviews, and as I mentioned, 450 interviews. There's a very interesting group of Chinese called the G. The last name is G. They are all from the southeastern part of China, near Hong Kong, near Canton. Anyway, you see that big map there. And then they're not all related by blood, but there are two groups of patriarchs who are very generous. Mr. C.Y. Chu, so there are two brothers. This is C.Y. Chu and Wen-To Chu. They were actually college educated in Hong Kong and then finished their education in California at Berkeley Business College. Not the Berkeley we know today, but it's a different college. But when they graduated, nobody was hiring them. Nobody wanted to hire Chinese. So that San Antonio Chinese grocer hired the two brothers to San Antonio to teach their children Chinese. Very soon, one of the brothers figured Houston is a booming oil town. There's business and money to be made. So he came to Houston, opened the first grocery store, asked his brother to come, and then many other Chu-related people, whether they're from the same village or they're related by friendship or maybe distant blood, would come down to Houston. They would give them a little bit of seed money, put them in their living room until they were able to make a go of it and maybe take a little percentage of their business. So there was a cluster of Chinese grocery stores started with the Chu brothers. And then there's a very generous man, Harry G. Sr., who's here. Harry G. Sr. came to the U.S. when he was 14 and really worked hard washing dishes. But by the time he worked, saved every penny. And by the time he was 20, he was able to open a restaurant in New Orleans that had a band. I mean, he was really entrepreneurial. And he figured Lake Charles, Louisiana, Houston is all on this oil corridor. So he moved his restaurant from New Orleans to Houston. And again, like the other two brothers, whoever would come and seek his help with a connection to the G's, he would help them open a restaurant, and then he became very, very popular and very kind. And so these two people really began this G family network. Okay, good. So then,
Can I ask you,
Yes.
when did the two brothers come? What year was
yeah,
it?
1940s, 1950s.
Oh, the 40s.
Yeah, it's pretty
Okay.
early, pretty early. Yeah. So then often when we interview these people, they don't want to tell you money. I train my students to say, ask them how much they earn. And how much did this cost them? This is what for, oh no, I don't remember. But then I figured there was a book called Dun and Bradstreet Report, which is, you all know, it's a company that sends out business assessors across the country to assess businesses. They dropped a book. They're supposed to take back them all to New Jersey. Somebody dropped the book and was in the Houston Metropolitan Archive. And the librarian said, I got a book, do you want to look at it? It was a 1950 copy. And it had the restaurant that this Dun and Bradstreet person was assessing in Houston. So Harry G. Sr., the person I said was very generous, one of his restaurants, the China Star, the one on the green on the upper right, had an annual estimated sale of $75,000 to $100,000, 1950. And so you can imagine also that many of these restaurant transactions in cash, they may not even report it. So it's not a small thing. It's a pretty well-to-do operation. The one on the bottom, China Clipper, 500,000. I think I got a little too excited. That's what it says on the book. But Harry G. Sr.'s son, Harry G. Jr., told me that figure is probably after Harry G. Sr. sold the business to an American owner. So this is not a reflection of a Chinese restaurant. However, you can see Harry Sr. had this cluster of 5 restaurants. Others are smaller. I mean, the other G family got much smaller. Some of these, like Frontier Restaurants, Silver Bowl, annual sale of $5,000 or something. But Harry G. Sr. is pretty big. His cousin, Albert G., took it one step further. You can see Albert G. has 8 restaurants, and then one on the top, Ding Hao has 75,000 to 100,000 annual sale. He is my rock star go-to story. He's really fun to listen to. Okay, so Albert G. is a cousin to Harry Sr. Albert opened a restaurant called the Polynesian next to the Shamrock Hotel on Main Street. Shamrock is where people took national entertainers, people like Bob Hope, I don't know how many you know who Bob Hope is.
Yeah.
And also people like Dale Evans and Roy Rogers, even the chimpanzee who ran the earth. I mean, these were entertainers. They all came to entertain the Shamrock Hotel. Maxine Messenger, who's a society columnist for the Houston Press or Chronicle Post, lived in the Shamrock Hotel, which I did not know that, but she lived there. So she would take these entertainers to lunch at Albert G's restaurant, and Albert G probably didn't charge them or charged them very little. This totally charming, charismatic guy. You can see a picture of him serving Bob Hope. People like Pearl S. Buck even came through town to entertain. So then he was written up constantly in the newspapers, and he became the president of the Houston Restaurant Association, which is not an Asian concern. It's an association that covers all the restaurants in Houston. Albert G's wife, Jane, who is actually next to Richard Nixon, was actually a Rice student. She came from this wealthier San Antonio grocer family. Father wanted to go for pre-med, she went to Rice, and she was doing well, except she would walk past Albert G's restaurant. Albert G persuaded her, she dropped out of Rice and married him. And she said she did not dare go home for 6 months. Her father was furious at her. Once you met him, always forgive him, he's really smart. So then Albert G, his wife Jane, was the president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Houston Restaurant Association, and she wrote all of Albert G's speeches. Albert G gave to the political campaign of John Connally, the governor, gave money to Richard Nixon's campaign. So when Nixon came down to visit Connally, Connally gave a big party at his ranch, and Albert G and Jane G were invited. So to me, that's an upward mobility to restaurant story. Albert G has two brothers, very quickly. Gordon G had another restaurant, and where the politicians like Mayor Louis Welch, who was running for mayor, plotted his campaign in Gordon G's restaurant. And Gordon said, oh, I never charged them, So when the mayor became mayor, the mayor's right-hand person said to Gordon, we really owe you something. What would you like? The mayor really owes you. And Gordon said, no, I don't need anything. And the guy said, no, we really owe you. Just tell us what you like. So Gordon said, well, my cousin is an attorney. Now, he would love to have a job in the city. So I think the first Asian American city attorney of Houston came through because there's a connection. And then Wallace, the younger brother, Wallace G, opened a cafeteria within the police headquarters. So that you can imagine they never got a traffic ticket. So this is extremely intelligent way of doing this, right? But beyond that, Albert G also had a very big civic role in that, I think in 1960-61, a student from Texas Southern University, led by Algerie Stern, decided to go and sit at the Foley's department lunch counter and demanded to be served. So of course, immediately the lunch counter closed, everything's closed. Then the mayor of the city called the president of TSU, said, you should call back your student, they're going to be disturbing peace. To the credit of the president, he said, well, my students are exercising their civil rights. They're not doing anything bad. The students were well dressed, were very polite, they just sat at the lunchroom counter. So then the mayor called up the city police, and everywhere in the country, race riots were going on, pretty violent. And they said, we got to solve this much more intelligently and peacefully. So then Foley's had a very big advertising count with the Houston Chronicle, I think, or the Houston Post. Houston Post or Chronicle, I can't remember which, is headed by John Jones, the nephew to Jesse Jones. And I think John Jones and Jesse Jones are just very open-minded people. And so John Jones basically told Foley's through the advertising account that, yes, you're going to start serving African Americans on such and such a day. At the same time, we're not going to report this in the newspapers. So for 9 days, this integration happened, but it was not reported. And Albert G's role was that he was the head of the Houston Restaurant Association. So he went into the African American community, told the publisher of the African American newspaper 4 times, bring your citizens, well-dressed, well-behaved, to the lunchroom counters. They will be served. And then a famous reporter named Dan Rather was at the time reporting in Houston. He was vilified by his colleagues. The colleagues said, you're supposed to be reporting on the news. What are you doing sitting on the news? But because of that, the lunchroom integration in Houston happened relatively peacefully. And I was like, so it takes an Asian to be the right one to go with that. Actually, back in Houston, practicing, I think at MD Anderson, pediatric oncology, but she also started a medical group for people who do not have insurance. I mean, she's kind of giving back. Paul Chu, he's a superconductivity guy. If you know U of H, he has a lab there. He's rumored to be on the Nobel track because he's, superconductivity is about lowering the temperature of your whatever it is. Anyway, he's president of the University of Hong Kong. etc. Lin Cho Liang is a Juilliard violinist. He's the same group as Itzhak Perlman, very famous, and Rice is very lucky to grab him from Juilliard to be faculty member here. Teresa Chen, she's actually a lawyer, a judge. She was a master's in chemical engineering from Taiwan. She came here, she was, doing platform work, platform work and all that, but somehow she took an interest in politics. And she went to law school and she ran, and she's a judge today. Qimei Lin, she actually runs one of the biggest civic organizations in Chinatown. It's called the Chinese Cultural Center, or Chinese Community Center, CCC, where they perform services for seniors and English classes, vaccination classes, citizenship classes, and now they're building senior homes. So these are the different kind of Chinese that have come into this country post 1965. Then we quickly move on to the Japanese. We have, as I mentioned, the Japanese were basically very highly respected early in the 20th century. So the Texas Chamber of Commerce needed Japanese farmers to develop a new strain of rice that's hardier for Texas than what they had. So they invited the Consul General from New York, who's a nobleman, a Japanese nobleman, to come to Texas, show him their land, and say, can you bring your friends to Texas to farm? He did. He brought some of his aristocratic friends from Japan. Mr. Saito Saibara is one of them. So Saibara, and these people came into Texas and bought the tens of thousands of acres of rice land and planted rice. So that is the house of Mr. Saibara in 1900 in Weber, Texas, and those are the rice plantations. They did succeed in developing a new strain of hardier rice called Shinriki rice. However, there was a big drop in the price of rice across the world in 1908, and so many Japanese lost money. And even though they were welcomed by the official of Texas, in their neighbors, they would encounter lots of xenophobia, lots of racist anger. So many Japanese went back to Japan and didn't bother. But Mr. Saibara stayed, and we interviewed his granddaughter, who's still today. And many went out of the rice business into fruit farming, etc. Today, as we know, in America, the defining trauma for the Japanese was the internment experience, right? So when World War II happened, FDR issued an executive order relocating Japanese people, not everywhere, but those on the West Coast mainly, like Oregon, California, into intern camps. And when they interned them, they basically lost all their businesses, their assets were confiscated. Mr. Glenn Gondo, you all probably know him because of sushi. All the HEB stands with sushi stands in HEB, they're all Mr. Glenn Gondos. His parents were interned, but he said, my parents love America. Even after internment, after lost everything, they never spoke ill of the country. They made us speak English only, so he doesn't speak Japanese well. The parents did not want him to speak Japanese. They managed to get the money back. The parents worked really hard. At the beginning, they were part of this Bracero program. So in California, there was a government program that imported Mexican laborers to California to work in the fruit farms. His mother would cook, have a boarding house and provide lunch and dinner, breakfast for these Mexican workers, and earn enough money eventually to open up a jewelry store on the East Coast, and eventually came down to Houston. There was a Japanese restaurant called Tokyo Gardens on Westheimer, and that was Glenn's family restaurant. Mm-hmm. But today, Glenn has taken it to a different level. He's a caterer used to cater for Continental Airlines, United Airlines. Now he's catering for ANA Airline and has 200-some sushi stands all over the country, doing very, very well. He gives back to the community. Donna Cole is the CEO of a chemical company. So her father, so the Japanese men were interned, but they were also recruited to the army and conscripted, and so they really want to show the patriotism, right? You think we're enemies, we're actually patriots. So they were in their own battalion, the 100th Battalion, 442nd Regiment, full of Japanese Americans. They were given the order by their commander to go to a mountain, I can't remember, it was France or Germany, Southern Europe, to save a group of Texan Rangers on top of the mountain. The mountain was ringed by German machine guns, and these Japanese soldiers said, you guys go and save them. So there's a question, did the commanders white? Did they think that the Japanese were better dispensable father or not, but who knows? And so I read an account where it said, these Japanese soldiers said, oh my gosh, these guns have trained us, what do we do? It was dead silence. Suddenly, one brave soldier stood up and yelled, "Banzai!" and then charged up the hill. Of course, was gunned down, but then his friends all charged up the hill. So in the end, they did save these Texan Rangers, but more Japanese were killed doing that than the people saved on the mountain. They had a motto called "Go for Broke." So Donna and her friends created this foundation because when they came back, they were still interned, and Congress never acknowledged their heroism. So the Go for Broke Foundation, with the children and descendants of these soldiers, managed finally to Congress to issue the congressional, posthumously many times, a Congressional Medal of Honor for what they've done. So that's a Japanese story. And then quickly go down to the Indian Americans, and most of them came after 1965. You know, there were very few Indians here. A huge group here, very educated, highest per capita income. They have their own community activities, services. The Sri Meenakshi Temple in Pearland is a beautiful temple, Southern Indian. They brought Indian architects, and they create lots of activities in there. We interviewed people with them. The house on the right, India House, is also another civic organization for Indian members to help each other, the new immigrants who come and settle in Houston. My story that I go to is Daya, this woman, Lakshmi Paramasaran. It's a South Asian Women's Center. So her husband was a surgeon, recruited to Flint, Michigan in the early, 1970s, 80s, because there weren't enough doctors. She was welcomed into the community, lived in an apartment complex where upstairs was another Indian couple. And she said the wife would always come and be with her. She said, well, we're very hospitable. It's fine to have this lady come and sit with me. But she wouldn't go home, even after Lakshmi's husband came home. Every day, and she said, very strange. Finally, after a few months, the woman said, my husband having an affair with a nurse, and he's bringing her home. I have nowhere to go. So Lakshmi was trained as a social worker in India, and she's always thought, I do hear things in the Indian community, but nobody talks about it. We should do something. But then her husband, they decided to move from Michigan to Houston for better schooling for the kids, and she joined a club who are made up of the women, of the wives of the Indian doctors. There's a club for them, and they gossip and they hear things. And they say, no, we hear so-and-so, but we're not sure. We really don't know if the women are abused. And then finally, in 1970-something, someone they knew, a woman who had a professional job, killed her husband, killed her 3 children, burned the house and killed herself. This is an Indian woman. Turned out she's been abused for 20 years, that she never told anybody. Even though she would listen to other people's trouble, she never said anything. At that point, Lakshmi and her friends said, that's it, we've got to do something. So they started passing out their own home phone numbers, and she tells my intern, lucky her husband was so busy in the hospital, he didn't mind that she just passed out a phone number. So they began with just a hotline, like an answering machine, and then they staffed with one person answering the phone. And today, Daya has a budget of $1.some million. They field 4,000 some phone calls. They had a halfway house where they'd pull women out of an abusive situation, bring the children over, give the women English classes, which didn't speak English, driving lessons, find a job, go to court with them to sue the husband. Now they're just renting. Apparently, halfway houses are expensive and not necessarily the best way, because then the women have to go from one traumatic situation and settle in this transient halfway house, and then afterward they have to move her to another permanent home. So now they're just moving women out of abusive situation into a permanent situation, rental apartment, and then go from there. And they're doing, and the reason why South Asian women don't go to Houston's Women's Center, for instance, because they sometimes don't speak English. The food is very different. The cultures, the religious practice is different. They just don't feel comfortable burdening themselves on the women of a different culture. And that's why Daya is so important for these people. And then there's another group of ladies that we've interviewed. Dr. Sumit Jain is an engineer who has retired, and he's vowed to propagate Jainism in this country. Jainism is a part of Hinduism that is extremely nonviolent. So every day when they get out of bed, they have to say a prayer in case they step on an insect. They do not only do not eat meat, they don't eat potato and carrot, because the act of pulling that root out of the earth is violent. So it's a very, very nonviolent sect. And his friend Atul Kotari, they decided to start an internal Gandhi museum here, meaning they want to propagate the principle of nonviolence, especially to school children. So they've already bought the land. It's on this corridor, West Airport, in Missouri City, where there's, I think, a Zoroastrian temple, there's a Buddhist temple, a Turkish something or other. So it's going to be a nice corridor of very diverse, multi-religious institutions. Okay, so then we moved on to Filipinos. The Philippines was a U.S. protector after the Spanish-American War. Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S. And then, so the Filipinos were not aliens. They were basically U.S. nationals who can come and go to the U.S. at their will. They're not citizens, but they're nationals. A third of the people in the boat died, and I just saw them die in front of my eyes. And finally, the 10th time, she came out and managed to get a refugee camp and came to Houston. So she was a motivational speaker, and she's retired, and she began something called the Institute for Civic Education in Vietnam, where what she does is hire professors who can translate Plato, Aristotle, Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill, these Western philosophical tracts into Vietnamese and put them online, because those are the tracts that are banned today by the Vietnamese government. And she's hoping that people in Vietnam could Google and understand these kind of philosophy. And then she told us in the middle paragraph that I need to serve because the freedom that I'm given is just priceless. I have to live for those people who died on the high sea, never seeing the freedom. I have to live for the people before me who died in the jungle, never knowing their future, their families. So that's what she's doing. And we know many Vietnamese women are nail salon workers because it only takes $5,000 to start a salon and only like however many hours of practice. So it's very easy. So you have sisters giving another business to brother, to sister-in-law, to friends. So that's why we have such a ring of nail salon operators, the Vietnamese. Dr. Dang on the right is actually got his PhD in Florida right before the fall of Saigon in agriculture economics. And he said, I went back to Vietnam thinking I can help the new Vietnam. But because he was Western trained in America, he was followed as a spy. He said, everywhere I went in Vietnam, they suspected I was a spy, and there was no freedom. So he decided to leave. But it was so dangerous on the sea, there were so many pirates, that he told his wife and his only son, stay in Vietnam until I can come and get you. And it took him many, many attempts, and there was a wave of pirates. The first wave would come and take your money, and the second would take your food and your clothes, and the third wave, basically, you're lucky you didn't die. He managed to get to a refugee camp in Malaysia or Thailand, and because he's a PhD, the UN people put him in charge of the camp. And he said the hard things he saw, not only on the sea between the pirates and the refugees, among the refugees, but the horrible things that he saw in the refugee camp, were things that were burned in his brain he'll never forget. So when he came back to the States, he said, if I went into academia, my work would be with a few students, and that's just not enough to help the people. I need to do a lot more. So he quit teaching. He was in Houston, and he started working with the FBI and the Houston Police Department. With the police department, he said in the Chinatown Vietnamese area, there were very few police officers who were Asian, and it was very hard for the Vietnamese community to communicate with them. So within 5 years of his work with the police department, there were 200 officers of Asian American descent, and that helped a lot. He also worked with the FBI in order to identify Vietnamese gang members and keep the community safe. So these are only a few of the story. Okay, and then these artists, and during the Black Lives Movement, these laser cut things were angry. They're supporting the Black Power. We're not just submissive Asians. And then many Vietnamese became quite successful. At first, some of them went to Kima, the area where they were shrimpers, right? But then many of them got into trouble with the KKK, and very quickly they figured it's smarter to do other business. So they would get the shrimp and the fish from the Gulf Coast, then they would put them into supermarkets, and they would open restaurants. So it became a vertically integrated industry. Very soon they're wealthy enough to just leave Kima and just come out of that area. Some of them have huge shopping centers like this. Real estate, they did very, very well. But their beginning was just harrowing. And we hear stories, children who witnessed their parents being killed in front of them in seas. And when you hear that, and you hear what's happening in Ukraine, and when the Ukraine crisis happened, they held many discussions among themselves, like, we had gone through this, we got to help them one way or the other.